Over the next few weeks, we will be interviewing the authors from the collaborative book, The Grief Experience: Tools for Acceptance, Resilience, and Connection, which is set to release in February of 2024. These authors have each experienced their own unique grief journey and will be sharing their personal stories with us. We will also explore the specific tools they used to cope with their grief and how these tools can benefit others who may be going through similar experiences. Grief is a complex and challenging process, and each person's experience is different. By sharing our stories and tools, we hope to provide support, guidance, and comfort to those navigating their grief journey. Each author has experienced different types of loss and comes from a variety of backgrounds, beliefs, and experiences. As a result, they offer valuable insights and perspectives. We are honored to have them join us on this podcast series and to share their stories and tools with you, our Path 11 podcast listeners.
Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to the Path 11 podcast. I'm very excited to bring our next guest onto the podcast. She is a good friend of mine, also one of my Reiki Master graduates. We've known each other for quite a while, and up until recently, we shared some beautiful office space, but I have moved my studio into a bigger space just because things have gotten a little crazy with some sound healing instruments that I've been buying. And so looking to do a little more sound healing. So I missed those guys already, and it's only been like 5 days. But my next guest, she has been on the Path 11 podcast before. I think we did a little bit of a panel recording with Cheri Davies, who you guys are also familiar with if you listen to some of our more recent podcasts this year. She's one of the experts on grief. And Cheri and I are going to be working with her again and working together on a new book. So let me tell you a little bit about Cheri. She is an LCSWR, is a highly skilled and experienced licensed clinical social worker with over 15 years of experience in the field of mental health. She has a master's degree in social work from Adelphi University and has worked in a variety of settings, including hospitals, schools, and private practices. She's also the owner of Cheri Davies Coaching, where she is focused on teaching and writing. And Cheri and I had a Reiki session, I want to say it was like 1.5 or 2 years ago, and something in that session, I don't remember, but I'm like, Cheri, I think you got some books. You're going to be writing some books. And she was feeling like this soul's calling to write. And she's like, I'm going to have like 3 books under it very shortly.
Right? You told me it was 7.
Well, it's 7. Okay.
You told me 7.
You're going to be up to 3, I think, by next year.
Yeah.
So she is a contributing author to Holistic Mental Health Volume 1, and she has signed on for another Holistic Mental Health Volume 2. And then the one that we are collaborating with is called The Grief Experience, and she is also a contributing author there, which is what we're going to talk about. And we both have worked with our good friend Cheri Davies from the Center for Informed Grief. She's worked with Cheri also on divorce trainings for school personnel. And outside of work, Cheri enjoys spending time with her family, her friends, exploring the great outdoors, and pursuing do-it-yourself projects, which she is great at. And she's also active on social media, and you can follow her on Instagram at Birch Hill Counseling for insights and inspiration related to mental health and wellness. So, Cheri, welcome back to the Path 11 podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, so I'm really interested in your story and to have this podcast recording for a variety of reasons, because you are going to be sharing with our audience today about anticipatory grief and what that is. And Cheri will give you a little more information, but her husband was diagnosed going on about 5 years ago with early onset Alzheimer's. Is that correct?
Yep. They call it younger onset now, but it's early onset. They're the same thing. It's just now they call it younger onset Alzheimer's.
Right. So in the book, The Grief Experience, we are all writing a different chapter in the book about different types of grief and bereavement. And Cheri is going to share her story about what it is like to have anticipatory grief and what she has been going through with her husband. She has made a lot of connections in her own community. She's on television all the time advocating for the Alzheimer's Association. She's on our local news channel, I feel like every month.
Yep.
very active in this community trying to fight and find a cure for this. So, Cheri, why don't you give us a little bit of background about you and your husband and kind of what life was like before and when you started to kind of notice that maybe some things were changing in Chris?
Sure. So my husband, Chris, around, I would say like 48 years old, there was a noticeable change in kind of how he was doing things. And he wasn't paying attention, it seemed like, to small things. You'd leave the house, he'd be like, where were you? Where were you going? I'd come back from, getting my hair done, and he'd be like, where have you been for 4 hours? And I'd be like, my hair's all new. And so he wouldn't know things that he normally did, right? It was stuff that he had always noticed that now suddenly was kind of going out the window. And I just thought, our son's in high school. We're very busy. Our son was in sports. There was a lot of travel, all that kind of stuff. So I thought, just our lives are busy. He's just not paying attention. And so when my son was a junior, he was taking an AP Psych class, and he comes home from school. It was like in the spring of that year. And he's like, Mom, I want you to see this brochure. I think Dad has Alzheimer's. We learned about it in school today. And I was like, your dad does not have Alzheimer's. Your dad's just, we're overwhelmed. We've got a lot going on. He's just not paying attention. Like, that's crazy, right? Because, he's like 40, 49 years old. So didn't think anything of it. The following summer, we're camping. We camp with a lot of friends. And one of Chris's really longtime friends came up to me in the middle of the week, and he said to me, there's something wrong with Chris. He's like, he keeps telling me the same thing over and over again. He's not realizing that he said it, things like that. And I was like, no, like that's just no. But a little bit inside the back of my head was kind of like, well, that's weird because now Aiden has said something to me and now her friend has said something to me. So I kind of paid attention the rest of the summer, and I started kind of chalking up a few like weird things that happened. We went on another vacation with his family, and I had changed the color of the duffel bags, and instead of his black bag, we had red, and he kept asking me, where's my black duffel bag? And it was really not something that was normal for him. So that October, we went to the doctors, and he was going for his regular physical. And I was like, I'm coming with you. I just want to see. And when we got there, his primary care physician and him had already been talking about his memory issues. And so that was a little shocking. So we kind of talked about what was going on. And then the doctor gave him what's called a mini mental status exam. And so kind of went through a few things. And then they did, if you were like the clock that's in the back of my office here, right? The regular clock. He had him draw the circle, had him draw the numbers in it, and then told him to put the hands to like 10 to 11. So it's a 3 or 4 step process, right? All at once, he told him. And Chris ended up drawing, the clock was like the shape of an oval. The numbers were all messed up. He couldn't get the time. And I was like, what is happening? It was, when you say shocking, it's not a strong enough word for how I felt in that moment. And so it was pretty clear at that moment that there was actually something very wrong. And now it goes back to, we can track it back to when Aiden was a junior in high school. So from that process there, we started, getting testing done, getting a neurologist. And within the next year, he was diagnosed with younger onset Alzheimer's.
Wow. And so this really isn't a diagnosis that I think most people associate with young people. So how does it onset early? Do we know what the causes are of this, or what could possibly be some of the contributing factors? Does it run in his family or?
Right. So younger onset Alzheimer's is typically not one of the familial types. It can happen, but it's not typical. There's really only about 200,000 people in the US who have younger onset, although you're starting to see it pop up a lot more. And I think some of that has to do with a lot more information. People are starting to be more open to going and talking about it. So you may see those numbers rise. But at this moment, the doctor has said they don't really know. Could be environmental factors, could be something, he had some concussions playing, sports and doing things, in his job over time. It could be a combination of things, but there's not a real specific answer as to why he got it. Nobody in his family had younger onset, so it's not like it's something that went through. He does have Alzheimer's in his family. Although the interesting thing is we just did some genetic testing and he doesn't have any variants for even later onset Alzheimer's. There's a specific marker you can look for. He doesn't have that. So this is really an anomaly. And again, when you're looking at younger onset, it's hard to kind of wrap your head around that if somebody's having kind of things that look like not paying attention, you just attribute it to other things like we did. We just attributed it to life, getting older, like, just being busy. And so it's not like when you're in your 70s where you're starting to kind of have that general, there is some forgetting, things like that. So you pay a little more attention to it. We just had no idea.
Wow. Wow. So, and I'm just going to ask a really benign question here, just in case anybody else has it. But can you tell us the difference? What is the difference between Alzheimer's and dementia? Are they very similar? Are they similar diagnoses, or what's the difference between one and the other?
Sure. Dementia is the category of different types of memory loss. So there's frontal temporal, which is a specific one that's in the front of your temporal lobe, has different features. Alzheimer's is pretty much the most general one of all of them. So dementia itself Alzheimer's is a dementia. Dementia is just an umbrella term for any of these memory loss types of situations.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So when you first got the diagnosis, clearly, like you said, once you started putting the pieces together, you think it was actually onsetting at least a year or year and a half earlier than when you got the diagnosis. And now you're coming up on the beginning of year 5. Yes. So what has there been a lot of deterioration? I mean, what has each year brought? And maybe we can kind of bring in this anticipatory grief and kind of talk about that and what is that? Because ultimately, I guess we're assuming that this is how Chris may pass and transition from Alzheimer's.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he has a terminal illness, and that was the first thing that we had to wrap our heads around. There is no cure. And so, that's the difficult part of this, is that you picture your life of what it's going to look like. When I'm, 51 years old, I was like, this is what my future looks like. This is what we're going to do when we retire. And you suddenly lose that future. And so when you talk about anticipatory grief, that starts right there for me, is where I was like, wow, my future has now just been completely taken away from me. And so you have to grieve that on and on and on. It doesn't stop, right? It's not always the same level. And that's how grief is, right? There are days where, today I got up, it was a great day at my house. I came in to do this, feeling good, right? So I'm not in that grief mode today, but I'm going to guess that after we're done with this and I have a chance to process all of it, I'm going to feel it again. And that's what happens is, for me, I have to look at my future all the time. And our world is really everyday Alzheimer's. What does that look like? So in the beginning, a lot of it was, how do I live on my own? How do I take care of things? Do I live in my own home? Do I get an apartment when down the road? Like, how do I take care of him? As younger people with Alzheimer's, right? We are looking at, your son was in college at the time, right? How do we continue to pay for college if we need services for Chris? How do I, make choices on what does my retirement look like? What do I live in this house? How do I take care of this? Right? Things that you don't think about on a daily basis. Like, I don't mow the lawn. Like, I don't plow the snow. Like, those things, there's day-to-day things that I think you don't really acknowledge until something like this happens. And so for me, a lot of the grief has been not only with knowing that Chris is going to die and having to kind of look at what my life looks like in that aspect. There's so many other things that go along with that. It's the grief of the dream of our life together, right? So that's a death that I have to look at, because he's not going to be around when we're 70. There's just no way. So it comes and goes. And then that anticipatory grief is really about all those things that you miss. There's also, for me, what does that look like for Aiden? What does that look like if he has children? Like, Chris won't be the grandfather there that we hoped he would be. How does that play into things? So it's really multifaceted when you think about anticipatory grief, and each person's situation is so different based on where they are.
Right. Yeah. And is there a life expectancy that one is given with the early onset of how many years? Like, do some people deteriorate more quickly than how Chris is? Is he on a really good track compared to others? Is it case by case? What are you looking at in terms of that?
So it's really interesting because younger onset Alzheimer's typically runs significantly faster than regular Alzheimer's. So we have a friend who has just passed away from younger onset Alzheimer's as well. And she had it for 5 years. So Chris is starting his 5th year. And so we would think generally that he would be farther along. What his doctors in our recent appointment said is that because Chris works out so much, he works out 4 days a week. He's completely socially active because we make sure that happens. And he eats right. We monitor all those kinds of things. His progression has gone a lot slower than they anticipate. So really at almost 5 years, he should really be far more disabled than he is. So we feel really fortunate that we're in the position that we are, because it's actually not normal for the progression that he's in. He actually should be farther down the road.
Wow. Okay. So really, that speaks a lot to keeping the body physically active, having a really good social environment, connection with friends. I know, he still goes on like camping trips with his friends. It's not like his life has stopped. You guys still do a lot of stuff together. So what is like your typical day like now compared to the first year he was diagnosed? Like what is it like in your house to, live with somebody with this, and how have you guys adjusted, and, what is that like?
Yeah, I liken it a lot of times, and it sounds, somewhat funny, but I liken it to having a really giant 8-year-old in my house. So he's independent in a lot of ways, but there's a lot of things still that I have to follow up on, that I have to kind of monitor, right? So at this point, like, he's not cooking because we want to keep, safety at the house. There's things that had happened. So so it's really a lot of planning on my part, just like you would if you had a younger kid, right? You're going to make sure they have their breakfast, their lunch, their dinner. You're going to plan things out. When I was working evenings, we had family members who would take him for dinner. So my parents live out of state. So if I have to go visit them, it's really planning on who's going to like take him for dinner each night, because he can live independently in our home right now. We have a dog who wasn't really an emotional support animal, but he has become one. So that's been great for us too. But there is a lot of planning that goes around it. He's fairly active in terms of he mountain bikes with his brother, but like those are things now that he doesn't go on his own. We don't want him getting lost in the woods. So like now his brother will go with him, and it's great because they get along really well. So that's really helpful. Our friend group is pretty amazing. He's had friends that he's had since elementary school, middle school, who really come together at least, they live down south from us. And, they'll drive up at least once a month to do stuff with him, go places. And then our friends that are local are constantly, they're doing like movie nights, they're doing things together. They're going, even if they're just hanging out, they've really come together and they're cherishing the time they have, because again, they're going through all the same anticipatory grief, because their friend that they've had for a lifetime, some of his friends have been in his life longer than I've been in his life. And they're going through the same thing of realizing like, we're not going to be, old guys hanging out fishing together down the road. Like they're going through exactly the same thing.
Right. And do you see Chris grieving in any way? Like, what is his level of awareness of what is happening to him and what's going on?
Yeah, Chris is fully well aware of what's happening to him. And he's pretty amazing, I have to say, because he is just one of these like roll with it kind of guys. He's just like, I accept it. I'm going to live my life to the fullest. And that's really what he's doing. And he's doing what he needs to do to try and stay as healthy as possible. So again, he is very, very good about like, he's like, I'm going downstairs. We have a home gym now for him. He works out 4 days a week. If he hasn't worked out like every other day, he's like, oh, I got to get down there and do it. And it's really keeping him active. You'll see things now. It's more difficult at this point in time where he can't read anymore because he can't follow along stories. He's not watching new movies anymore because he can't follow the plot. So we're watching a lot of like old fun stuff that like we just started watching Seinfeld again. He loves Seinfeld. and we're going through those stories. But, I'm seeing at this point, right, things where like even in a half-hour show where he's still losing track somewhat of who characters are and like what has happened in the show. So, and it's getting more difficult as time goes on. So, it's a lot of just kind of acceptance that, okay, we're just doing the best we can do and trying to see the positive every moment that we are spending this time together, that we are, he is happy. And that's kind of a check in I do. Like, how you feeling? Are you still feeling happy? Are you okay? So, it's difficult, but, you do have to really kind of forge into what are we making the most of now?
Right. And are there any like do's and don'ts for people who might be listening that may have somebody that has the later onset Alzheimer's, but any do's and don'ts or tricks that you've learned along the way? Like, if Chris is forgetful, do you correct him or do you just go along and answer the same question 20 times as if it was the first time you answered it? Are there just some suggestions or some tips that you've learned, and have also been educated on what is really helpful in supporting a person, with this terminal illness? And what are some things that you would recommend, you don't do, or certain reactions or things like that?
Yeah. It's definitely been a learning process, and it has been, certainly one of those things that along the way, you do have to kind of look internally as to how you're handling it, because it does make a huge difference. I can say in the beginning that it was far more challenging for me because the asking the same question over and over again was really difficult for me. I was like, oh my God, like I just told you this, right? You have to get used to that's happening. And for me, it was really about changing my mindset of like, okay, he's not asking me to annoy me. Right. This isn't about like, he's not doing it on purpose, but it takes some time to move into that. Right. And so for now, when he's asked me the same thing 15 times, I'm like, hey, like, yep, here's the answer. Right. I just kind of go with like, I'm not reminding him he's asking me 15 times. It doesn't serve any purpose. It makes him feel frustrated. It makes me feel bad that I was being a jerk about it. Right. So it is answering the question over and over again. When he loses something and, if he puts, his sunglasses down and can't find them, it's kind of, for me, it's like, all right, do you want me to help you find it? Do you, let me look for them for you. So if, I can kind of gauge now that I know where I'm at, what I need to do in that situation. It takes time though. And I will say I was not very good at it at the beginning. It was very frustrating. It was very difficult. So immediately, one of the things I did was I got myself a really good therapist who understood, what grief is like, understanding terminal illness, because for me, it was a lot of processing all those feelings I had about what my life was going to be. And that sounds really selfish when you say it out loud, right? But it's actually not. It's really important, because if you don't take care of yourself, you are going to crack under the pressure of what you have to deal with. So for me, it was finding a good therapist, talking to my friends when I really felt like, hey, I need somebody to talk to. Or on the flip side of like, I just can't do that. I just don't have it. That's just not my energy today. Like, I got to stay home. I got to relax. I got to do whatever. So being able to speak to what I really needed, I had to figure out what that looked like for me and for our family. So it's a process, right? It didn't happen overnight. I would say at year going into 5, I'm pretty good at it. It's not perfect, but I'm pretty good at it. Year 1, it was bad. It was not good at all. It was a lot of like, hey, are you asking me this question? So that's definitely the first thing, is figure out what you need, because I always liken it to think about when you're on an airplane, right? The air masks come down. They tell you put them on yourself first before the other person. It is really the same thing with this. If you don't take care of yourself, you are not going to be able to take care of anybody else. And I have not only just myself to think about, but I do have, my son's 23, and yes, he's an adult, but he's still going through this as well. So you do have to think. The second thing I really did that I would encourage everyone who has anyone who's dealing with any kind of dementia is reach out to the Alzheimer Association, because they were invaluable. They came and met with me probably within the first maybe couple months. And that care manager comes out and they go through everything that you might need to know going forward. So it's pretty general, but they're really a great support. And They have support groups, they have classes you can take, there's online things, there's online support groups. So you can figure out what works for you. For me, it was less about doing the groups and it was more about doing advocacy work. And so like you were talking about, I've done, I'm on TV quite a bit, advocating whenever there's something coming up. I'm on a committee for one of our Washington, D.C. representatives. So I do advocacy work through that. And so for me, that helps me feel like I have a little bit of control over kind of what's going on, because the reality is I don't, right? So that I feel like I can help maybe down the road. Maybe this is things that will help maybe my son and anybody after him, right? That won't maybe have to go through the same things we are. Getting a great support system in terms of who your medical care is. We had a great neurologist. We're just in the process of switching because he had unfortunately left where he was working. So we're moving over to a new one, but having people that you trust in that, whether it's their social workers, the doctor, their nurses, their nurse practitioners, really knowing that. And in New York State, we're really lucky. There's 10 centers for excellence for Alzheimer's care. And for us, one is in Albany and one's in Glens Falls. So we're really fortunate we're between both of them. So that's been a gift for sure on our end. And so, it's really taking care of yourself. And it's hard to do because, as much as I preach that, I know there's a lot of things I could still be doing better for myself to do that. But, you have to do the best you can. And it's day by day. Some days are better than others.
Yeah. And I'm wondering if some people who are listening are also curious to know, what are the interventions for Alzheimer's? What do the doctors do? Are there certain medications or certain interventions that you guys have tried? And again, each person is an individual that you've thought has been helpful outside of Chris's, routine of working out, nutrition, and community.
Great. So in the beginning, there was definitely medication management options that we utilized, and it was one of the first one we used was Aricept, and that seems to be the first line that they use with dementia. And, it worked great. But the unfortunate part is these are medications that are short term. So it worked for about, I would say 7 months, which I think was about a month longer than they actually told us it would work. So we got 7 months out of it, and it basically stalled his progression for a period of time. So that was really fantastic. There was about 3 or 4 more that we tried after that. And based on different side effects and it not always working, he ended up really within, I would say 2 years, he was off medication because at that point we had gone through the gamut. The somewhat exciting part is that there are some new medications coming out now. They do have some really significant side effects. So it's one of those things that, again, you need to really talk to your doctor about. For us, we are, with Chris being so young, we are looking at exploring those options. So again, when we have our appointment next month, we're going to look at what that really looks like. But they're pretty significant side effects. It's infusions at this point. It's no longer oral medication. So there's a lot to it. So you do have to decide, you have to kind of weigh things out. And a lot of these medications are really for only early on in the progression of the disease. So that's, again, why it's really important that if you're having memory issues of any sort, why you really need to talk to your doctor instead of being afraid of well, I don't want this to be anything. You really want to catch it early so that you can use some of those, from the medication standpoint, is those are only good early on. So if you don't catch it, within the first few years, you kind of are not going to be able to access a lot of these medications. In addition to that, there's a lot of things you can do. So in the beginning, we did a lot of making sure he was reading more, making sure, taking in vocabulary, doing things that would stimulate his brain. If he was, we did puzzles and he did Sudoku, and we did, there's a game called Bananagrams, which is like Scrabble. It's fun, but we get a little competitive with it. So, but those are early on things, keep his brain active. One of the very funny things that we did that's not for everybody is, so my husband is an 80s child. So he loved all those Atari games and all those things like that. We actually found a video game system that usually goes in pizza places where you sit at it and play video games. We ended up buying one, and, I kind of thought it was silly at the time, but I do now, all these years later, see the value in it, because what happened was he was playing this game called Centipede where the worm comes down and he's got to shoot the worm and kill it and all this, that, and the other thing. And it's been keeping his hand-eye coordination really sharp. And so, and not only that, but he's entertained. It's keeping him happy and it gives him something to do. He doesn't really play it so much in the summer, but in the winter when he's really confined to the house, there's not so much to do. It gives him something to do for, he goes down 20 minutes at a time, comes up, does other things, goes back down. And it gives him something that he enjoys. And so for him, that was a great thing. In the summer, he loves to garden. He's outside. He's hiking. He'll go hiking with his cousin once a week and he does stuff with his brother. So really trying to find what are those activities that your person really enjoys and kind of figure how you make that happen. And sometimes, you have to be creative. For us, the video game was a creative option that, I didn't think was going to work. And it's turned out to be this amazing thing for him.
Yeah. All really great stories and great suggestions too, that some people may not even think of. But like you said, the eye-hand coordination, it's like maybe thinking it more as like entertainment or a video game, but really look at, what that has done and is working the brain,
Right.
when he's playing that.
And that's exactly right. Because you have to think there's, so for Chris, he just got diagnosed with, it's called idiomotor apraxia. And so basically he's starting to have difficulty with what his brain knows he needs to be doing with his hands is starting to become a little more difficult. So, that's a challenge. So him using this video game where it's got the roller ball, it's got the joystick, it's whatever, it's helping him keep that from declining at a faster rate. So you need to figure out what are the things that are happening, because with Alzheimer's, there are so many different ways that the course goes. And so you have to work with your primary, your neurologist, your primary care provider, and figure out what those things are. But knowing your partner, your loved one, your mother, your whomever, knowing things that they like, that's where you want to capitalize on those so that brings the joy also back into their life and you can use it as a tool as well.
Beautiful. Now, going back to kind of your anticipation of this and the grief, and what have you done action wise? Because sounds like you have some really good coping skills. You got your therapist on board, you have your friends, you have your support group. But like you said, checking in with what does my life look like? How am I going to spend my retirement? Do I downgrade this house? Do I stay in this house? And I know probably with our backgrounds, we're maybe sometimes less likely to stay in denial for longer periods of time because we know okay, we have to take some action. We got to utilize these coping skills.
Right.
I think that you've really utilized that and have looked far ahead. You've really faced, what your future may look like. So what are some things or have you taken care of anything in those future things that maybe make you feel a little more settled in this process where it doesn't feel as overwhelming, or you'll have more on your plate when he makes his transition? Any suggestions on what you've done that might help other people?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing for me, how I started was we went the healthcare route first. So a lot of that was we got an elder care attorney, even though we're walking in the door. We're not your typical elder care attorney people, right? But we needed one to help us guide us through. We needed healthcare proxy for him. We needed power of attorney. We needed some legal things that I didn't even know in the beginning what those things were, right? But you need to know what are, so does he have a do not resuscitate? Does he want certain things to happen? What are his wishes? And so at our age, we hadn't really talked about any of those things because we never really thought about it at our age. So really went through with a lawyer of what are those things that were on there, creating a will, making sure that we had all those things in order. So from a legal standpoint, that was really our first starting point. And it was really helpful because then as we went to doctors, I'm still at a point where I do have power of attorney over Chris when I need it. We're not at that point yet, but when I get there, I don't have to scramble to get it done. So that's a really great thing.
And
so
can I just interrupt you for
Sure.
just in case if people don't know what power of attorney is? What does that
Sure.
mean? What kind of decision can you make for him?
Right. So what the power of attorney allows for is that when he is at a point that he is no longer able to make decisions for himself, I now will be able to make all decisions. And so it's just a legal way of protecting really how our family wants to operate and what Chris's wishes are and how we've determined things to go, that it just helps not have any legal interference from other people who may feel that things should go differently. So it's just a protection for us. And again, it's one of those things that if you go to an elder care attorney to take care of all these, they're going to guide you on all these different steps of things that you need for your particular situation. For me, the longer term situation was much more, like you said, we do try to go through things with a little more quickly when we're clinical social workers and mental health professionals. But it was harder for me to wrap my head around the future piece on what I was going to do. I did kind of bury my head in the sand a little bit about like, what do I do and how do I kind of do this? But when Chris started getting some more decline, I really did, when medication wasn't working anymore, I had to really start to address, okay, we live in this house, we have a mortgage, there's a lot to taking care of a home, my son won't be living here anymore, it'll be just me. What do I want to do? And so I really had to sit down and think to myself, do I want to live in a condo? Do I want to live in an apartment? Do I want to live here? What kind of things do I really want to do? And so I had to really think about it from a different perspective because it was no longer a what do we want to do? It's a what do I want to do? And so it took some time for that. It was pretty painful to go through because, you don't ever want to admit that like you got to make these decisions on your own. And so I did struggle a lot of time with feeling selfish about like, well, now it's about me when, this really should be a time when it's about us. But I did have to think about what is my future and what does that look like? Because you have to be realistic at some point. And so at this point, really decided, yes, okay, I'm going to stay in my home. So moving forward with that being for me the right decision. And then kind of thinking about, now I pay attention to what were all the things that he was doing that I need to figure out how to do. So, I've gotten pretty adept at, how do I kind of fix a faucet and how do I, if this is going wrong or what do I need to do? And then, you figure it out, right? And I've asked a lot of questions and I've had to ask for some help on some things like I can't do electrical stuff. So I've definitely had to ask help for, fixing a light fixture. You do have to kind of step out of yourself and figure out what that looks like. But it does take some time and it's not easy and it is painful along the way. But once I did decide that I was going to stay in the house, it was a lot easier for me. I felt a really big sense of relief that, okay, I've made a decision. Now I can figure out what that looks like for me going forward. And the nice thing is, listen, I live in a house that if somewhere down the road it becomes too much, I can sell it, right? It's not the decision I make today doesn't mean 10 years from now, it has to be exactly the same decision. And so I think giving yourself the grace of like, okay, I've made this decision right now, but knowing that it can always change is really helpful and comforting.
Yeah, great. All right. Well, wow, that you've packed a lot into this podcast. So much was covered. I think you gave a lot of really great tips too. Any other resources that you, besides the Alzheimer's Association, anything else that you can think of, or any websites, or like you said, we're pretty blessed in New York to have so many different centers. But anything else that you think would be a valuable resource?
Yeah, I think really, anybody who's dealing with any kind of dementia, really go to, just if you go online and you look up the Alzheimer's Association, they're across the country. It's a nationwide organization. Their websites are so comprehensive that you can start there. And there's really not a lot within their whole organization that you can't find that you need. And, from there, it's really then partnering with your doctor. Your doctor in your local community might know other things that, are available to you, based on where you live. And I think that's important as well, whether you're here, because even if you're overseas and you're not in the United States, right, this website's still available to you, right? It's a starting point. And then you can kind of figure out what's in your community based on, they will give you an idea of maybe what you potentially need. And you can kind of start to go from there. For me, I will tell you, I really haven't had to go beyond the Alzheimer's Association because I've gotten everything I've needed from them. And it's really just been a huge gift.
Good to know. And, since you are going through this, have you thought at all about being a therapist for people who need support with a family member that has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's? I know you're it's a little raw and you're going through it. But, is there room for you to maybe also think about that and what you're doing in your therapy practice? Or do you think you're just going to kind of keep your therapy practice as it is and not really branch out in this area?
I think for right now, what I've decided is that, bringing it into my office, into my practice currently is probably not in anyone's best interest. So, certainly when I have people that come to me where they've got family members, I will guide them, tell them to use the Alzheimer's Association. A lot of people locally have seen me on TV, so they'll come in already knowing kind of my situation. I don't normally tell people, but they've seen me. So at this point, it's pretty out in the open. In terms of actually doing the one-to-one work right now, that's not in my plan. I could potentially see that down the road, when things are different. I don't ever see myself not working with the Alzheimer's Association in some way. So for me, potentially maybe down the road, adding this into my practice probably is the natural way it'll go. But for right now, I think the way things are going is great, so it's probably a future plan, though. It is definitely something I've thought about.
Yeah. Well, if you ever do that, people will be very blessed because I'm sure, there is that sense of comfort when people sit across from a therapist and, they know that they're coming from a place, maybe have lived some of that,
Right.
as well. But you're living it right now. So like
I am
self that space and take good care of yourself and
Right.
and really, really excited that this is something that you're going to be talking about in the grief experience book. Probably a topic that I don't know. I'd have to ask Kelly how many books have been written on anticipatory grief, or they like all sections, but I think it's a great subject for us to talk about in the grief experience book. And we will go ahead and put that link in our show notes. If any of you would like to, pre-order that book, it is coming out in February of 2024.
Yep.
So this podcast will probably be out before then. We are pre-recording these podcasts, but we do have the link in the show notes. And we also have the link to all of Cheri's social media sites. And if you do have a question, I'm sure she'll answer it if you'd like to give her an email. And just want to thank you so much for sharing your story and your vulnerability and, just being here and doing the best that you can. And, I just send all my love to you and Chris.
Thank you.
Really hope that you guys just move through the journey with grace and ease as best you can. And I think you guys are doing that. So,
you just got to do the best you can, right? And every day is different and you just got to take it day by day. And that really is how we operate. So, it's all you can do.
Absolutely. All right, Cheri. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for coming on the podcast again. And I'd like to thank all of you who are listening. I am sure that there are going to be a handful, if not, many people that this podcast is really going to touch the hearts of. And Cheri is just a wealth of information. So I also think this is a great podcast to share if Alzheimer's has affected your life, or you might even have a friend who's going through something like this now. Please share the podcast. This is a great podcast to do that with. So I thank you all for listening, and I will bring you another guest very soon. Take care, everybody.